The grand ballroom, known as the Crystal Pavilion, buzzed like a hive of golden bees. The air was warm, smelling of expensive perfume, fine wine, and roasted herbs. Chandeliers the size of small cars dripped light onto the scene, making diamonds sparkle on necks and laughter teeth seem even brighter. Men in crisp tuxedos talked in low, important voices about stocks and politics. Women in dresses that flowed like liquid silk smiled and nodded, their eyes scanning the room. This was a world of polished surfaces and whispered success. Between the tables, the waitstaff moved like silent shadows. They were a part of the machinery of the evening, meant to be smooth, efficient, and nearly invisible. Among them was a young woman. She was in her late 20s, with hair tied back in a simple, neat style. Her uniform was a plain black dress with a white apron, clean and sharp. Her eyes, a quiet shade of brown, took in everything but gave little away. Her name tag read Alara, but no one at these tables ever really looked at it. Her hands were interesting. They were steady as she carried heavy trays of empty glasses. But if you watched closely, you could see a faint tremble in her fingers when they were still. They were not the soft hands of some of the other staff. There were faint calluses on her fingertips, old ones, almost gone, but still there if you knew where to look. The soundtrack to all this luxury was music. From the far corner of the hall, a beautiful, glossy black concert grand piano sang out smooth, cheerful tunes. The man playing it was excellent. His fingers danced over the keys without a single mistake. He played jazz standards, popular show tunes, all of it pleasant and sweet. It was perfect music for a party. It filled the space without ever asking to be truly heard. It was like the sound of a fancy fountain part of the decoration. Every time Ilara's path took her near the piano, her steps would slow, just for a heartbeat. Her eyes would flick from the floor to the keyboard, watching the pianist's hands fly across the ivory and ebony. For a split second, the polite, empty smile would vanish from her face. Something else would flash there, a deep recognition, a sharp focus, a touch of sadness. It was like watching someone look through a window at a life they once lived. Then, just as quickly, she would blink. The professional mask would slip back into place, and she would push through the swinging doors into the bright, noisy chaos of the kitchen. In the kitchen, it was a different world. The heat was intense, the voices were loud, and the pace was frantic. The head chef barked orders. Steam billowed from pots. Order for table 9, 2 filet, 1 salmon. Someone yelled, "We need more champagne flutes on the rack, now." Called the floor manager. Ilara moved through this chaos with the same quiet efficiency. She loaded her tray with fresh drinks, arranged desserts just so, and navigated the crowded room without spilling a drop. Her co-workers liked her well enough. She was reliable, she didn't complain, but she was also distant. She didn't join in the gossip during breaks. She would often sit alone on the back step, looking at her hands, flexing the fingers slowly, as if they were stiff. During one of these rare quiet moments, a younger busboy, new to the job, was wiping down a counter near her. "That pianist out there, he's pretty good, huh?" he said, trying to make conversation. Ilara looked up, pulled from her thoughts. She gave a small, non-committal nod. "He's fine," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Just fine?" The busboy laughed. "Sounds amazing to me. I wish I could play like that. Must be a great gig." A faint, almost invisible smile touched Ilara's lips. "It's one kind of gig," she said. There was no bitterness in her voice, just a simple statement. Before the boy could ask what she meant, the head chef called out, and they both jumped back into the rhythm of their work. Back in the hall, the evening rolled on. The laughter grew a little louder, the faces a little more flushed. The pianist finished a complicated run of notes with a flourish, and a few people at the nearest tables clapped lightly. He smiled, stood up, and gave a small bow. It was time for his scheduled break. He placed the fallboard gently over the keys, closing the piano's mouth, and walked towards the staff area for a glass of water. The grand piano now sat silent and majestic in the corner. Its silence was different. Without the blanket of music, the chatter of the crowd seemed suddenly exposed, loud, clattering, full of empty noise. For a few minutes, no one seemed to notice. The party continued. Then, a small boy, maybe 6 years old, in a miniature suit that matched his father's, wove through the forest of legs. He was the son of one of the event organizers, bored with the adult talk. His eyes locked on the big, shiny, silent piano. He crept closer, drawn by its size and mystery. He looked around, saw his mother was distracted, and with a mix of bravery and mischief, he reached out one finger and pressed down hard on a single, low bass key. Thum. The sound was a deep, ugly, discordant boom. It cut through the chatter. A ripple of laughter went through the people nearby. It wasn't mean laughter, but it was the kind adults use when a child does something silly. The boy's face turned bright red. He yanked his hand back as if the key were hot, his eyes wide with embarrassment. He turned and ran, disappearing into the crowd to find his mother. From across the room, Elara saw it all. She had just picked up an empty tray. She watched the boy press the key. She heard the ugly sound. She saw the laughing faces and the boy's shame. And something inside her, something that had been coiled tight and silent for a very long time, suddenly snapped. It wasn't a loud snap. It was quiet and final. It was a decision made in a single breath. The piano should not be an object of ridicule. That sound, that single wrong note, hung in the air like an insult, not to the guests, but to the instrument itself, and to everything it represented. Without a word, she put her tray down on a nearby empty table. She ignored the questioning look from another waiter. Her heart was now pounding, not with nervousness, but with a clear, sharp purpose. She smoothed her simple black apron, took a deep breath that filled her lungs with the perfumed, rarefied air of the hall, and began to walk. Her steps were not hurried, but they were direct and steady. She weaved through the tables, her eyes fixed on the silent, black expanse of the concert grand. The journey felt both endless and instantaneous. She was aware of a few heads turning, a few eyebrows raised in curiosity. A manager near the door started to move, a frown on his face. But Elara didn't see him anymore. All she saw was the piano. She reached it. She gently lifted the fallboard, revealing the beautiful, ordered rows of keys. She pulled out the piano stool and sat down. The leather was cool. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next silly noise. Elara placed her hands in her lap for just a second, looking at them, those capable, waiting hands with their almost gone calluses. Then she raised them, hovering just above the keys. She closed her eyes. The noise of the world, the clinking glasses, the laughter, the worried manager's footsteps, it all faded into a distant hum. And then she began to play. The silence she created was a living thing. It wasn't the quiet of an empty room. It was a thick, heavy blanket that had been thrown over the entire grand hall, smothering every other sound. The change was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like a physical force. For a long, breathless second, no one moved. It was as if the entire party had been turned to stone. Then, 100 pairs of eyes turned as one towards the corner. They saw the waitress. Just a woman in a plain black uniform, sitting impossibly straight at the magnificent piano. Her eyes were still closed, her face a mask of deep concentration. The first few chords still hung in the air, vibrating in the crystal of the chandeliers. A well-dressed man with silver hair, who a moment before had been loudly explaining a business deal, found his mouth still half open, the words completely forgotten. A woman reaching for her wine glass let her hand hover in the air, unsure what to do next. The manager, who had been striding over to stop her, skidded to a halt a few feet away, his professional anger dissolving into pure shock. This was no simple tune. This was a storm. The music that poured from the piano was deep, powerful, and full of a raw emotion that the earlier pleasant jazz had never touched. It was music that told a story of struggle, of huge rolling sadness and a fierce fighting hope. It was Rachmaninoff, though most in the room didn't know the name. They only knew the feeling. It grabbed you by the heart and wouldn't let go. Her hands were a blur. They flew across the keyboard with a speed and certainty that seemed impossible. The powerful chords shook the floor. The delicate, running passages that followed sounded like whispered secrets, so quiet that people leaned forward in their chairs to hear. This wasn't just playing. This was a conversation between her soul and the instrument. Every note was chosen. Every emotion was laid bare. In the kitchen, the change was just as dramatic. The head chef, mid-shout, stopped. The waiters standing by the pickup window froze, their trays forgotten. The chaotic noise of the kitchen died down to the hiss of a single pot. They all listened. They knew that sound. They worked with her. That was Alara. The young busboy from earlier crept to the small window in the kitchen door, peeking through. His eyes went wide. "Whoa," he breathed, the word barely a whisper. No one told him to get back to work. Back in the hall, the audience was hypnotized. The music was taking them on a journey. It would build to a furious, passionate peak, notes crashing like waves, and then fall away into something so tender and lonely it made a few people's eyes sting. An elderly gentleman near the front, a man who had seen many concerts in his life, slowly took off his glasses and cleaned them with his napkin. His hand was not steady. A woman in a blue dress, who had spent much of the evening looking bored, now had tears silently tracking down her cheeks. She wasn't even sure why. The music just reached inside her and found a sadness she had tucked away. This was the magic of it. Alara was not playing for them. She was playing through them. She was somewhere else entirely. In her mind, she wasn't in the Crystal Pavilion. She was in a small, stuffy practice room from a decade ago, with peeling wallpaper and a stubborn, out-of-tune upright piano. She was a teenager again, with burning dreams and tired fingers, playing for a stern teacher. She was playing for scholarships, for a chance, for a future that once felt so certain. The music swelled again, a triumphant, soaring melody that pushed against the ceiling of the hall. Her body moved with it, bending into the keys, then lifting with the phrases. The simple fabric of her waitress uniform seemed absurd against the power she was commanding. It was a contradiction that made the performance even more stunning. This wasn't a concert pianist in a gown. This was the person who had just cleared your plate. At a prominent table near the center of the room sat a man with a thoughtful, intense face. He was a guest of honor, a famous conductor from a major European city. He had been enjoying the evening politely, but his mind had been elsewhere, thinking of tomorrow's rehearsals. Now he was leaning forward, elbows on the table, his head cocked. He wasn't just listening. He was analyzing. His professional ear picked apart the technique, the flawless phrasing, the dynamic control, the emotional depth. This was world class. This was once-in-a-generation talent. And it was coming from a waitress. He saw not just the skill, but the story. He saw the years of grueling practice in those sure movements. He heard the ghost of a great teacher in her phrasing. He also heard the long silence, the rust, the thing that happens when a great instrument is left closed for years. She was fighting that rust as she played, shaking off the dust of neglect with every passing bar. It was a battle, and she was winning. The final section of the piece began. The music became quieter, more thoughtful, a series of gentle, questioning phrases. The roaring storm had passed, leaving a landscape of quiet reflection. The crowd, almost as one, held its breath. You could hear the soft rustle of her uniform sleeve against the wood of the piano. You could hear the faint, soft press of each perfect key. She played the last, lingering note. It faded into the silent hall, not with a bang, but with a gentle sigh. And then it was over. Her hands came to rest gently in her lap. She sat perfectly still for a moment, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with a slow, deep breath. She seemed to be waking up from a deep dream. The world she had left behind, the chandeliers, the tables, the people came rushing back in. She opened her eyes. She looked at her hands, resting so calmly now in her black apron. They had done their job. They had told the truth. Slowly, she lifted her head and looked out at the sea of faces. For another second, the silence held. It was a respectful, awed silence, full of the echo of the music. Then it broke. It wasn't applause that started first. It was a collective gasp, as if everyone finally remembered to breathe. And then the sound hit her like a warm wall. The applause was thunderous. It wasn't the polite, tapping-clapping from earlier for the jazz pianist. This was a roaring, standing ovation. Chairs scraped back loudly as every single person in the luxury hall rose to their feet. Their faces were alight with amazement, with joy, with tears. They were cheering, shouting, "Bravo!" The sound was deafening, a physical wave of approval that washed over her. Elara's professional mask was gone. Her face showed pure, unguarded shock. Her lips parted slightly. She looked at the cheering crowd, then down at the piano, then back at the crowd. A flush of color rose in her cheeks. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the job. She did not take a theatrical bow. Instead, she gave a small, humble nod of her head, a simple acknowledgement. It was the gesture of someone not used to being seen. She began to stand up, her legs feeling a little weak under her, intending to slip away back to the kitchen, back to the shadows. But the world had other plans. As she turned, she found her path blocked. The famous conductor was already there, standing right beside the piano. He wasn't clapping. He was looking at her with an expression of deep, serious urgency. In his hand was a small, crisp white business card. He held it out to her. And beside him, the event's host, the man who had hired the other pianist, was also approaching. His face was not angry. It was filled with a kind of bewildered respect. He started to speak, his words lost in the roar of the applause, but his hands were spread in a gesture that said, "I am so sorry. And how is this possible?" All at once. Elara stood there, the noise of the crowd washing over her, the card in her hand feeling like the most important and heaviest thing she had ever held. The silent waitress had spoken, and now everyone was listening. The roar of the crowd was like nothing she had ever felt. It wasn't just sound. It was a physical pressure against her skin, a vibration in the floor. For a few heartbeats, Elara stood completely still, caught between the piano and the wall of noise. The small white business card in her hand felt alien, a tiny rectangle of crisp paper that seemed to hold an impossible weight. The famous conductor was still looking at her, his intense eyes searching hers. He had to shout to be heard over the applause. "Where did you study?" His voice wasn't demanding. It was filled with a kind of professional hunger. The words barely reached her. Elara simply shook her head, a small, slow movement. It wasn't a refusal to answer. It was that the answer was too long, too tangled in a past that felt like another lifetime. The music had said it all. Speaking now felt wrong. Seeing her overwhelmed, the conductor nodded sharply, understanding. He pointed to the card in her hand, and then pointed firmly at her, his meaning clear. You will call me. The event's host, a man with a flushed, apologetic face, was next to him, talking rapidly. I had no idea. My dear, that was. Please forgive the circumstances. His words tumbled out, lost in the din. He was a man used to controlling events, and this was something beyond his control. He looked at her uniform with a new, almost painful awareness. Elara finally moved. She gave them one more fleeting nod, a gesture of thanks, and also a plea for space. She needed air. She needed quiet. She turned and walked, not towards the grand entrance, but towards the service door at the side of the hall, the one that led back to the kitchen. Passing through that door was like stepping into another universe. The kitchen was silent, but it was packed. Every single member of the staff was there. The chefs in their whites, the waiters, the dishwashers. They were all lined up, not working, just staring at her as she entered. The only sound was the frantic hiss of a forgotten saucepan on the stove dot. Then they erupted into their own kind of cheer. It was rougher, louder, full of whoops and claps on the back. A young busboy was grinning like a madman. The head chef, a large man with a permanent scowl, was actually smiling. He gave her a thumbs up. Ela managed a weak smile in return, but her eyes were dazed. She moved through them like a ghost, offering soft thank you as she made her way to the back alley door. She pushed it open and stepped out into the cool, quiet night. The alley was dark, lit by a single yellow bulb over the door. The distant sounds of the city were a soft hum. She leaned against the rough brick wall, letting the chill seep into her skin. She looked at her hands. They were trembling now, the adrenaline finally releasing its grip. She could still feel the shape of the keys under her fingertips, the memory of the music vibrating in her bones. Inside, the party was trying to start again, but it was different. The buzz in the hall was now entirely about her. Guests clustered in groups, speaking in excited, low voices, gesturing towards the piano. The hired jazz pianist had returned to his seat, but no one was listening. He played a few half-hearted tunes before giving up, looking deflated. The magic had come and gone, and it hadn't been his back in the alley. The door creaked open. It was the floor manager, the one who had tried to stop her earlier. He looked awkward, holding a glass of water. Thought you might need this, he said, offering it. Thank you, she said, her voice hoarse. He shifted his weight, not leaving. Listen. About before. I was just doing my job. But that? What you did in there? He struggled for words. That wasn't a job. That was something else. It's okay, she said softly. And it was. None of the old rules seemed to matter anymore. He nodded and went back inside, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the business card. She held it up to the yellow light dot. It was elegant, understated. Just a name, a title, principal conductor, and a number for a prestigious philharmonic orchestra in Europe. Her breath caught. This was the kind of card that changed lives. The kind that opened doors she had believed were welded shut years ago. Her mind spiraled back, not to the practice rooms of her youth, but to a small apartment, quiet and dim, to a phone call that had shattered everything, a family illness, a sudden, yawning need for money that scholarships couldn't cover, the difficult, practical choice to leave the conservatory, to find work that paid the bills now, not someday. The slow, quiet death of a dream. The piano had become a piece of furniture, then a memory, then a dull ache she had learned to ignore. Waitressing was steady. It paid the rent. It let her help. It was real. She had tucked the dream away so deep that she had almost convinced herself it was a childhood fantasy. Until tonight. Until the sight of that boy and the wrong note had unlocked something fierce and unstoppable. The alley door opened again. This time, it was a couple of guests, a man and a woman in elegant evening wear, their curiosity having overcome propriety. They had followed her. "We are so sorry to intrude," the woman said, her voice gentle. We had to thank you. That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard." The man nodded. "I've been to concerts all over the world. That was a master class. What you have is a gift. You mustn't hide it." Elara thanked them, her voice still quiet. They left, but their words lingered. You mustn't hide it. The rest of her shift was a surreal dream. When she went back inside to finish her duties, she was treated differently. Guests smiled at her with new respect. Some stopped her to offer compliments. Her co-workers looked at her with a kind of awe. The weight of the card in her apron pocket was a constant, thrilling, terrifying presence. Finally, the event ended. The last guest drifted away. The cleaning crew moved in. As she was about to leave, the event host found her again. He pressed an envelope into her hand. It was thick. "Your regular wage is in there," he said quickly. "And a little extra, a token, for the unexpected performance." He looked embarrassed. "It should have been more. If I had known." She took it, murmuring her thanks. It wasn't about the money. It was the admission dot. She walked home through the sleeping city, the streets quiet. The envelope and the card were in her bag. Her mind was no longer quiet. It was a storm of questions. Could she really call that number? What would she even say? Was the talent still there, truly, or was it just a fleeting moment? The fear was immense, a cold, tight feeling in her chest dot, but beneath the fear, something else was glowing. A tiny, fragile, but undeniable flame. It was the feeling of her hands on the keys, perfectly in control. It was the memory of the silence of the hall, a room full of powerful people hanging on every note she chose to play. It was the look in the conductor's eyes, not pity, but recognition. She reached her small, ordinary apartment. She walked to the small, old upright piano that sat against the wall, covered with a shawl and a few photo frames. It had been years since she had seriously played it. She lifted the shawl and opened the fallboard. The keys were yellowed with age. She sat down. She didn't play Rachmaninoff. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys and played a single, simple major chord. The sound was slightly out of tune, a little thin in the small room, but it was music. And for the first time in a very long time, it felt like a beginning, not an ending. The silence of her lonely apartment was now filled with possibility. The waitress had remembered who she was. The next step was to see if the world was ready for her. The next morning, the world felt different. Sunlight streamed through the window of her small apartment, landing on the dusty lid of the old upright piano. Elara woke up with a strange feeling in her chest. It wasn't just the tiredness from the late night. It was a kind of buzzing, a mix of nerves and a wild, fragile hope. For a moment, lying in bed, she wondered if it had all been a dream. Then she saw her waitress uniform, neatly hung on the back of her chair where she had left it. And next to it, on the small table, were two things: the thick white envelope from the host and the conductor's crisp business card. It was real. She got up slowly. Her fingers, usually stiff in the morning, felt alive. She could still feel the ghost of the piano keys from the crystal pavilion, the smooth ivory and the solid weight of the grand's action. She made a simple breakfast, but her eyes kept drifting back to that card. The fear came in a cold wave. Who was she to call a world-famous conductor? What would she say? "Hello, you heard me play last night, remember?" He probably heard incredible musicians every single day. Maybe he gave out cards like that all the time. A polite gesture he forgot about by morning. The thought made her face flush with embarrassment. She tried to go about her normal Saturday. She cleaned the apartment, the dust dancing in the sunbeams. She did her laundry. But her ordinary life now felt like a shell, a costume she had stepped out of for 5 minutes the night before. The silence in her apartment was no longer just quiet. It was waiting. Finally, in the late afternoon, she could stand it no longer. She picked up the card. Her hands were sweating. She took her old phone, the one with a few cracks on the screen, and dialed the number with a trembling finger. It was a foreign country code. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It rang. Once, twice. She was about to hang up, relief and disappointment crashing together, when a voice answered. It wasn't the conductor. It was a woman's voice, efficient and polite. Maestro's office. How may I help you? Ilara's throat went dry. Oh, she stammered. Hello. My name is... He gave me his card last night. In the city? After I played. The words tumbled out, clumsy and small. There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the woman's voice changed, warming by a degree. One moment, please. There was a click, some quiet classical music, and then a new voice came on the line. It was him. Hello? His voice was familiar, direct. Hello, Maestro, she said, forcing her voice to be steady. This is the Waitress from the Crystal Pavilion. Last night. Ah! The sound was sharp, pleased. I have been hoping you would call. Tell me your name, she told him. Good. Now listen to me carefully, he said, and his tone was all business, no small talk. What you did last night was not a party trick. It was not luck. I have been in music for 40 years. I know what I heard. You have a profound gift, but it is rusty. It is like finding a Stradivarius violin in an attic. Beautiful, but it needs to be restored, to be played again, regularly. He didn't wait for her to respond. I am back in Europe tomorrow, but in 6 weeks, my orchestra has a short residency here in the city. We will be holding auditions for an interim pianist. One of our players is on maternity leave. It is a short-term position, but it is with a major orchestra. You will come and audition. Ilara felt the room tilt. Audition? For your orchestra? The words felt impossible in her mouth. Yes, do not look so shocked. This is how it works. Talent is discovered, then it must prove itself. The audition will be brutal. You will be up against conservatory graduates, seasoned professionals. They will have been preparing for this for months. You have 6 weeks to prepare. You must work. You must find a good piano. You must practice as if your life depends on it. Because for a musician, it does. He gave her the details, the date, the time, the pieces she would need to prepare. One of them was the very Rachmaninoff piece she had played. Play it again, he said. But this time, play it perfectly. Not with emotion alone, but with control, with precision, with the technique to match your heart. When the call ended, Ilara sat on the edge of her bed, phone still in her hand, for a long time. The buzzing in her chest was now a roaring in her ears. An audition. In 6 weeks, the panic was immediate. She didn't have a good piano. She couldn't afford a teacher. She worked full-time hours at the restaurant. How could she possibly get ready? But beneath the panic, a stronger force was rising. It was determination. It was the memory of that silent, listening hall. It was the look in his eyes, not offering charity, but offering a chance. A real, concrete, terrifying chance. She walked to her old upright piano and lifted the fallboard. She played a scale. It sounded tinny, weak, some of the keys sticking. This would not do. She needed an instrument. She spent the rest of the day making calls. She called the community music school, where she had taught beginner children's lessons years ago. The director, an older woman who remembered her, was thrilled to hear from her after seeing a blurry cell phone video of last night's performance that was already circulating among the local music teachers. "Use our practice rooms," she said immediately. "After hours. We have a good Steinway in room 3. Just turn off the lights when you leave." Next, she called the head waiter at the restaurant. She explained, her voice shaking, that she needed to cut her hours just for a while. To her shock, he had already heard the story. "The boss said to give you whatever you need," he said, sounding amused. "You're a local celebrity. Just don't forget us when you're famous." The support was overwhelming, and it gave her the first solid feeling that this might be real. That night, she went to the community school. The halls were dark and quiet, smelling of old wood and dust. She found room 3, and there it was, a beautiful, well-cared-for Steinway grand piano. She sat down. This time, it wasn't about releasing a storm of emotion. It was about work. She laid out the sheet music for the audition pieces. She started slowly, painstakingly. Her fingers knew the shapes, but they were clumsy, out of shape. A passage she once played effortlessly now required 10, 20 slow, careful repetitions. It was frustrating. It was humbling, but she kept going. Hour after hour, in the silent, empty school, she rebuilt herself note by note. She wasn't the waitress anymore in that room. She wasn't even the woman from last night's explosion of feeling. She was a craftsman, rebuilding a broken but beautiful machine, her own talent. She fell into a new rhythm. Her days were a blur of work, sleep, and practice. The restaurant became a place she visited, her real life happening in the quiet practice room under the fluorescent lights. Her co-workers would ask how it was going, and she would just smile wearily and say, "It's going." The conductor was right. It was brutal. Some days were terrible. She would hit a wall, a complicated section that refused to come clean. Doubt would creep in. Who did she think she was? She was too old, too far behind. The ghosts of the young, hungry students she would be competing against haunted her, but then she would have a breakthrough. A difficult run would suddenly flow smoothly. The music would come together, and for a few minutes, she would feel that old power, that connection, but now under her conscious control. Those moments fueled her through the exhaustion. 6 weeks is not a long time. It passed in a frantic heartbeat. The day of the audition arrived. She wore a simple, plain black dress, not unlike her waitress uniform, but different. She felt hollowed out with nerves, but also solid with preparation. She had done the work. There was nothing left in her dot. She arrived at the concert hall, a place she had only ever seen from the street. Inside, it was all cold marble and hushed voices. Other auditionees were there, mostly young, clutching instrument cases, their faces tight with focus. They glanced at her, this older woman with no accompanist and a look of fierce concentration, and then looked away, dismissing her. When her name was called, she walked onto the vast, empty stage. The auditorium seats were dark, but she could make out the shapes of the audition panel sitting in the middle. The conductor was there. He gave no sign of recognition, no smile. This was Business Dot. The grand piano on stage was the most beautiful she had ever seen. She sat, she took a breath, and she began to play. This time, there was no surprised silence to win over. There was only the cold, critical ear of professionals. She played not for a cheering crowd, but for a verdict. She poured everything into it, the years of lost time, the weeks of punishing work, the last embers of a dream she had carried since she was a child. Dot. It was not perfect. She knew it. A slight stumble in a treacherous passage. A moment where her tone was not quite as clear as she wanted. But it was honest. It was powerful. It was finally the work of a musician. She played the final note. The sound faded into the dark hall. There was no applause. Just a quiet, "Thank you." She stood, her legs weak, and walked off the stage. The wait was over. The work was done. Now, she would have to learn to live with whatever came next. The walk from the dark stage back into the bright hallway felt longer than the walk onto it. The silence that followed her playing was heavy and final. It was the silence of judgment, not of awe. Her heart, which had been a thunderous drum during her performance, now felt like a small, cold stone in her chest. She collected her things from the waiting area. The other pianists, still waiting for their turn, avoided her eyes. In their world, no news was bad news. A smile, a nod from the panelist who escorted you out, those were good signs. A silent, swift exit meant you were already forgotten. She pushed through the heavy doors of the concert hall and stepped out into the afternoon light. The city noise rushed in cars, people, life, and it sounded harsh and meaningless. For 6 weeks, her entire world had narrowed to a single goal, a single set of notes to master. Now, suddenly, the goal was gone. There was only the empty space where it had been. She didn't go home. She walked without direction, her simple black dress feeling like a costume from a play that had just ended. The conductor's words echoed in her head. Asterisk, you will be up against the best. It will be brutal. Asterisk, he was right. She had felt it in the room. The cold professionalism of it. Her performance had heart, yes, but heart might not be enough. Not against technique that had been polished every day for the last decade. She found herself outside the community music school. It was closed, but she had a key now. She let herself in, the familiar silence of the hallways a comfort. She went to room 3, to the Steinway. She didn't play her audition pieces. She just sat on the bench, her hands in her lap, and stared at the keys. This is where she had rebuilt herself. This is where the hope had grown. Now, it felt like a museum of a future that might not happen. The days that followed were the hardest. The frantic energy was gone, leaving behind a deep fatigue and a restless uncertainty. She returned to her full hours at the restaurant. Her co-workers, at first excited to see her, quickly sensed her mood and stopped asking. Life settled back into its old rhythm, but it didn't fit anymore. She felt like a ghost moving through her old routines, clearing tables, taking orders, her mind 1,000 miles away, in a dark auditorium. A week passed, then another. The silence from the orchestra was absolute. She checked her email constantly, jumping at every notification. Nothing. The hope, once a bright flame, was now a dying ember. She began to force herself to accept it. It had been a beautiful, crazy dream. A single moment of magic that didn't translate into the real, competitive world. She had her answer. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, she was in the back of the restaurant, refilling salt and pepper shakers, a mindless, endless task. The lunch rush was over. The television above the bar was on, the volume low, showing a daytime talk show. Her phone, sitting on a stack of napkins, buzzed. Not a call. An email. She wiped her hands on her apron and picked it up. The sender's name made her breath stop. It was from the orchestra's administration office. Her finger trembled as she tapped the screen. The email was formal, concise. Asterisk, dear Ms. Alara. Asterisk, asterisk. Following your recent audition for the interim pianist position, we thank you for your time and considerable talent. Asterisk, her heart sank. This was the preamble to a rejection. She had read enough of them in her younger life. Asterisk, we thank you. We were impressed. But unfortunately, She forced herself to read the next line. The panel was deeply moved by the distinctive musicality and emotional conviction of your performance. While the technical demands of the role are extreme, we believe in the exceptional quality of your artistry. Asterisk. Asterisk. We are pleased to offer you the position. Asterisk. Please find the attached contract. Asterisk. The words blurred. She had to read them 3-4 times. The sounds of the restaurant, the clatter of dishes, the cook's shout, the hum of the fridge, all melted into a distant, muffled roar. She couldn't hear anything but the pounding of her own blood in her ears. Asterisk. We are pleased to offer you the position. Asterisk. It wasn't a dream. It was a document. With terms. And a date to start. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there in the dim storage area, surrounded by jugs of ketchup and boxes of straws, completely still. The feeling that washed over her wasn't the sharp joy of the standing ovation. It was deeper, quieter, more profound. It was validation. It was a door, not just cracking open, but swinging wide on its hinges, revealing a path she thought had been erased from the map of her life. Slowly, a smile began to form. It started small, just a softening at the corners of her mouth. Then it grew, spreading across her face, lifting it. It was a real smile, one that reached her eyes for the first time in weeks. She walked out into the main dining area. The head waiter was counting receipts at the bar. He looked up, saw her face, and his own expression shifted from boredom to curiosity. "You okay?" he asked. She held up her phone. "I got it," she said, her voice strangely calm. He didn't need to ask what. The whole restaurant had been following the saga. His eyes widened. Then he let out a loud, "Yes." That made the remaining customers jump. He came around the bar and gave her an awkward, hearty pat on the back. The cook peeked out from the kitchen, a grin splitting his face. That night, she called the number on the business card again, the direct line to the conductor. He answered on the second ring. "You got the email," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." "I don't know how to." "Do not thank me," he interrupted, his voice stern but not unkind. "You earned this. You did the work." The panel heard what I heard, a voice. A true musical voice. "Now the real work begins. You will be challenged every day. You will be surrounded by musicians who have done nothing but this since they could walk. You will have to catch up. You will have to prove yourself, not just once, but at every rehearsal." "I understand," she said. And she did. The audition wasn't the finish line. It was the starting gate. "Good," he said. Then his tone softened, just a fraction. "Welcome back." The word echoed in her mind long after the call ended. Welcome back. Back to the world she had left. Back to herself. In the following weeks, her life changed shape. She gave notice at the restaurant, her last shift a celebration with her coworkers, who toasted her with soda from fancy glasses. She signed the contract. She began to study the orchestra's repertoire, the music now not just notes on a page, but her new job, her new language. The day of her first rehearsal arrived. She stood outside the musicians' entrance of the grand concert hall, not as an auditioner, but as a member. She was wearing new clothes, simple but professional. In her hand was a folder of music. Her heart was beating fast, but it was the beat of anticipation, not fear. She took a deep breath and walked inside. The backstage area was a chaos of cases and chatter, musicians tuning, laughing, greeting each other. They glanced at her, the new face, some with curiosity, some with a cool, professional appraisal. She found her place on the stage, at the magnificent grand piano positioned near the conductor's podium. She arranged her music. The conductor walked in, gave the room a sharp nod, and raised his baton. He looked at her, just for a second, and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The first downbeat fell. The orchestra around her erupted into sound, a powerful, complex wave of music. For a second, she was overwhelmed. Then her moment came. Her eyes found the notes. Her hands found the keys. And she played, not as a waitress having a moment, not as an auditioner hoping for a chance. She played as a pianist. She was finally home.